In this news roundup of the week, President Biden talked about Trump's threat to democracy, while his supporters care more about whether their kids are in school or not. Another UK jury acquits campaigners in spite of the facts of their guilt not being in dispute. And the standoff between tennis number one Novak Djokovic and the Australian government continues. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. As predicted, the anniversary of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol building was made into a huge deal along partisan lines this week. President Biden said that Trump was holding a dagger to the throat of America and said that American democracy was facing the gravest threat to its survival since the Civil War. And he said this: he's done what no president in the history of his country has ever done. He refused to accept the result of an election and the will of the American people. It remains a valid criticism and one that I've made myself. It's not entirely true that nobody on Biden's side has ever disputed the result of an election, mind. Hillary Clinton said that she believed that Russian interference was to blame for Trump's 2016 victory, and at one point she speculated about a challenge to the result that would be historically unprecedented. And away from the presidential level, Democrat Stacey Abrams claimed to be the real governor of Georgia in spite of losing the election, saying that the process had not been proper. Now, of course, neither of those instances involve the candidate instructing the vice president to intervene in a fantasy constitutional manner, so it's fair to say that unprecedented things certainly did take place. It's also true to say that the invasion of the Capitol by rioters mixed in with a bunch of rather surprised gawpers was not a planned insurrection, in spite of the rhetoric. No, it didn't nearly overturn the peaceful transfer of power. The people were cleared from the building within 3 hours, in spite of the fact the Capitol Police had been woefully unprepared for such an event, and the confirmation went ahead. An event like that is only a coup if there is some institutional support, some credible mechanism for interrupting the transfer, and there was none. Worth commemorating, worth discussing. But of course, really the objective was to play for political advantage, because the Biden administration is doing extremely badly right now, and any opportunity to focus attention on an area where they feel the high ground is embraced. It probably doesn't cut through, because what's really driving the current unpopularity of the administration are issues that are much closer to people's daily life. Yes, people are COVID weary. Biden unwisely promised that if he had been in charge, then all those people who died from COVID when Trump was around, they would not have died. It was a ridiculous claim when he made it during the election. I said so at the time. And obviously since then, the virus has refused to be tamed simply because Joe Biden wishes it were so. And the measures that have been taken to try and make that happen are really starting to hit ordinary people. So whether or not kids go to school has become one of the biggest measures. Even left-wingers such as Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, are turning against the teacher unions that are trying to keep kids out of school in the name of COVID safety. She accused them of fear-mongering and hysteria and insisted that children should be in school, and they were, for 2 whole days before the teachers union took its members out on a strike. It's just the latest in a rolling tide of chaos on this front. For instance, tens of thousands of Chicago students were given take-home PCR tests before the Christmas break. According to the New York Times, of nearly 36,000 tests that were handed in, around 25,000 of them had invalid results. And this is the real problem for Joe Biden. While he can engage in soaring rhetoric about the fragility of American democracy, people are asking basic questions like, are the kids in school? People want some semblance of normality and stability, and yet the chaos persists and seems to have no end in sight. Where is the end game? Even the New York Times, a left-leaning paper, acknowledged that current school closures, quote, appeared to be concentrated in regions such as the Northeast and the Upper Midwest, where Democratic Party policymakers and teachers' unions have taken a more cautious approach to operating schools throughout the pandemic. That is what happens when you have a leader who promises to defeat the virus, I suppose. But it stands in stark contrast then to the high-profile example of, for instance, Ron DeSantis in Florida, where he has been extremely clear and consistent that Florida schools will remain open regardless of who catches Omicron. Students suffer more harm, he says, by the damage to their education. And the ground has started to shift because increasingly it seems that parents are starting to agree with this. Education was a big issue in the recent Virginia governor election. Talk about critical race theory in schools was a high-profile aspect of that for sure. Justin Webb pointed out in the Times of London that an analysis of voting patterns showed that the shift to Republicans came in counties where school closures had been the longest. The Republican candidate Youngkin had pushed the message that Virginia's excessive and extended school closures ravage student advancement. Other Republicans, of course, have been studying Youngkin's playbook rather carefully since his victory, and Biden is aware of all that. His administration came out in support of Lori Lightfoot's stand against the teacher unions. Whether that's enough in the face of the huge current contrast between Democrat-run states and those high-profile Republican ones on this specific issue, that remains to be seen. There are echoes of this in the UK as well this week. Boris Johnson has at least kept the children in schools, but did so with the concession that children should be required to wear masks in school. Now, I'd highlighted before recent research that suggested that while requiring staff and teachers to wear masks had been shown to make a modest difference to infection rates, requiring it of pupils produced results of no statistical significance. And it turned out this week, via documents released by the Department of Education, that this was true even of the study that it was using to justify the introduction of those masks back into schools. It came from a study that was a comparison of 123 schools that used masks versus 1,200 that didn't during the Delta wave. Now, arguably, that's already extremely out of date, given Omicron's higher transmissibility. They had an identical absence rate at the start, which declined over 3 weeks to 3.6% in schools not using masks and 3% in those that were. With a sample size that small, however, that difference does not reach the threshold of statistical significance. Why does research suggest it has some effect for staff and teachers, but not for children? Well, Simon Clark from the University of Reading told the Times of London this. As the report points out, face coverings can become contaminated quickly, so repeated putting them on and taking them off and touching them could present an opportunity for viral transmission. Expecting children to wear them properly all day and to keep them clean is somewhat optimistic. That phrase, somewhat optimistic, I'm taking as a euphemism for completely delusional. But what they are for kids is irritating and distracting and apparently a barrier to healthy social interaction, which is possibly why in some schools it's now being reported that large numbers of children are just refusing to wear them. Damien McNulty of the Teachers Union NASWUT told the BBC, "Sadly, we have reports in the last 24 hours of at least 6 secondary schools in the northwest of England where children in huge numbers are refusing to take lateral flow tests or to wear masks. We've got one school in Lancashire where only 67 children out of 1,300 are prepared to have a lateral flow test and wear masks. This is a public health emergency." Is it though? If we take what the studies say seriously and we look at the mild impact of Omicron with people in younger age groups, is it really an emergency? According to the government's evidence summary, 80% of pupils reported that wearing a face mask made communication more difficult, 55% felt it made learning more difficult, and indeed 94% of head teachers said that masks made communication between staff and pupils more difficult. Even the government's arguments as to why they were a good idea focused on psychological impact, not on Omicron or health impact, saying that mask wearing could be a visible outward sign of safety behaviour and a reminder of COVID risks. Not a benefit that seems to outweigh the negatives reported by the head teachers and the pupils, you would have thought. Meanwhile, weighing up the evidence and coming to a rational conclusion seems to be at risk in other areas as well, as another jury trial in the UK seemed to turn on the sympathy for a campaigner's cause rather than the actual facts of the case. Well, we'll come to that in just a minute. But first, recently high-profile entrepreneur Elon Musk said this.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. And yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite. Please look at the numbers. If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble. Mark my words.
People often talk about population growth as a problem, that human numbers will become unsustainable on a finite planet, but there you have Elon Musk saying the exact opposite. He's not the only one. So, what are the arguments? Can we have a sensible discussion on the topic without being accused of some fairly remarkable intentions? That's what I'll be looking at in the first deep dive video to go live in 2022 on this channel, 7 PM UK time on Monday next week, wherever you stand. Maybe on Zanzibar, a reference that will make sense when you see the video. But wherever you stand, it's an important topic, so join me for that. In the UK, 4 Black Lives Matter activists were found not guilty of criminal damage by a jury after they pulled down a statue, spray painted it and rolled it into the dock in Bristol. There was no dispute that the activists carried out the actions. Instead, the defence lawyers had argued that they were on the right side of history. They claimed that the presence of a statue in the city itself constituted a hate crime. And since the statue belonged to the people of Bristol, they could not be convicted for damaging their own property. None of those is a legal argument. But it didn't matter, and the case became the latest where the apparent sympathy of a jury for the activist cause made them unwilling to convict on the basis of undisputed facts that made them guilty in law. Previous cases included the Extinction Rebellion activists, who likewise did not dispute having committed criminal damage and had no defence in law. The judge told the jury they had no defence in law, but they walked free anyway. By the way, this is different to what happens, for instance, in the Kyle Rittenhouse case in the US, where the valid legal arguments were focusing on the facts of the case and whether they fit the definition of the charges being brought. It's a good rule of thumb, usually, to say that unless you were in the courtroom for the whole trial or able to view it without hindrance, then you shouldn't be deciding that you know the facts better than the jury who were, hence pronouncing on whether they got the right or the wrong answer. That doesn't apply when the facts are not contested, the judge is clear that there is no legal defence to suggest the crime has not been committed, and yet the jury acquit anyway because of arguments that have nothing to do with the legality, being on the right side of history or whatever. One of the 4 drove the point home after the verdict. We didn't change history, we rectified it. This is a victory for Bristol, this is a victory for racial equality, and it's a victory for anybody who wants to be on the right side of history. Yes, we all want to be on the right side of history. The point is, it's history that gets to be the judge of that, not you. Niall Gardiner of the Heritage Foundation suggested that it gave a green light to others. It sets an extremely dangerous precedent. The result of this ruling will be that mobs will seek to tear down statues across the country. Well, no doubt it will give encouragement to other activists, although in a legal sense it does not set an actual precedent. And particularly since the government strengthened the laws against vandalising statues after this incident took place. But if juries are reluctant to convict in spite of demonstrable facts, then that's simply a different law for them to refuse to enforce. Changing the law isn't going to change that. And this is the challenge, whether these recent results are an aberration or a sign that people are losing respect for the rule of law per se and due process in the face of political sentiments. The process that The Guardian described approvingly as juries seeing the bigger picture. Of course, they love it, so long as the aberration favours their political perspective and not the other lot's. At the moment, the focus has been on damage against property. But what if it moves in due course to judgments against people? People who are held to have committed hate speech in the same tenuous way that having an old statue can now be described as a hate crime. We're some way from that. But it's a concern nonetheless that the legal system that served us relatively well for centuries could in certain cases end up as little better than a kangaroo court. And speaking of kangaroo courts, That's probably how Novak Djokovic feels right now, as he looks forward to a weekend in a detention hotel in Melbourne, waiting to appeal the decision to refuse him entry. Djokovic is the world number one tennis player, really by all the stats, the greatest tennis player of all time. And particularly, he has owned the Australian Open, the first tennis Grand Slam of the season. Since 2008, he has been the champion there 9 times, which is more than any other champion by far. But although people tend to love success, Djokovic has proven, whether fairly or not, to be rather less loved than his rivals in the Big Three, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal. And playing into that recently has been his refusal to get vaccinated and his pointed refusal to talk about his vaccine status. That led to a month of would he, wouldn't he, would he, wouldn't he. Djokovic needs just one more major to overtake his rivals because all 3 of them are sitting on 20 each right now. Would he get vaccinated in spite of his objections so that he could play his best tournament and achieve that goal? Would he be allowed into Australia in spite of his status due to some other loophole? Well, the latter was what he attempted to do, and he announced that he'd been granted a medical exemption after applying within the rules. That exemption on the basis that he'd had COVID in the last 6 months, something that was not previously known. If that was true, then all he'd done, let's be clear, was to follow the rules, and in so doing had been found to qualify. But the Australian Open is being held in Melbourne, the most locked down city in the world by all accounts, and the granting of a medical exemption to Djokovic within the system that had been agreed turned out to be hugely controversial. People presumed it wasn't fair. They presumed it was one rule for megastars and another for everyone else. And at a time when people had been polarised and turned against each other on the grounds of their vaccination status, those that had followed the rules deeply resented those that in their eyes had not pulled their weight. For context, Australia's Northern Territory has just announced a lockdown of the unvaccinated. Is Djokovic the victim here? Well, not really. I mean, as Rafael Nadal noted, he had made his choices as he had a right to do, but choices have consequences, and it was always well known that Australia would require vaccination for entry at this point in the pandemic. We might argue about whether those restrictions are right or fair, but you'd probably start that discussion by focusing on all the ordinary Australians and their families who would have been affected first before you got to world superstars. But there's no doubt been some extraordinary political opportunism as well. The country's health minister, Greg Hunt, appearing on TV to boast that Djokovic would be sent on the next flight home. Prime Minister Scott Morrison declaring rules are rules, especially when it comes to our borders. They didn't mention at the time that a small number of other tennis players, identities unknown, had also been granted medical exceptions on the same basis. There have been some suggestions that those players were able to produce more supporting documentation than Djokovic had to hand. Now that this has all blown up, authorities are hurriedly going back and double-checking. That said, there's a suggestion that Tennis Australia may have granted exemptions that didn't actually meet Border Force requirements, in which case the fault would come down to them. And those other tennis players could easily find themselves objected as well in similar fashion, all for no fault of their own. Letters from federal health authorities have come to light informing Tennis Australia boss Craig Tiley that people who were not vaccinated and had contracted COVID-19 in the past 6 months would not be granted quarantine-free travel to Australia. But the way the politicians have responded, particularly locking Djokovic up in a hotel used to house illegal immigrants known to provide really poor conditions, it seemed as though they were responding to the public outrage and targeting Djokovic to get political points, rather than pointing to any breach of the agreed process per se. There's a federal election in 4 months' time. Morrison's speech on this was full-on campaigning for that election. Djokovic's lack of lovability has meant few people feel a huge amount of sympathy for him. It seems to have been forgotten fairly quickly now how he donated money to help Australia's relief efforts in 2020 after a year of devastating bushfires. I stand with Australia, he said. Now, making a charitable donation doesn't mean you can get around the law, of course. Now they are floating the possibility that he may get hit with a 3-year ban from entering Australia in the future. That would surely push the whole thing into the realm of the punitive, and you would have thought that all that previous goodwill would at least have counted for more than that. Meanwhile, Australia wasn't the only one trying to come to terms with what Omicron and COVID means for regulations and for government. Italy became the latest to decide that the Omicron wave meant that more authoritarian action needed to be taken. It announced this week that COVID-19 vaccinations will become compulsory for the over 50s from next month. It said that this was to be done to combat surging infections. Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister, said this: "We are working in particular on the age groups that are most at risk of being hospitalised to reduce pressure on hospitals to save lives." So, rather than seeing pressure on hospitals as a logistical issue to be met with planning and resource utilisation, instead it turns immediately into an enforced medication policy. The vaccine pass will be needed by the over 50s in order to access their workplaces from mid-February. This is in spite of the fact that, looking at the curves in South Africa and just starting to show now in the UK, it seems pretty unlikely that Italy will get to mid-February without having gone past the peak of infections from Omicron anyway. But of course that's not the point. If you have to be double vaccinated by mid-February, then you have to start straight away. So as always, these policies are more to do with pushing the unvaccinated to cave in the short term than they are about the actual punitive action to be delivered when the deadline arrives. Right now, of course, Italy is one of those seeing soaring cases, around 189,000 on Wednesday this week. Italy can perhaps be excused for being jumpy, given that it was one of the countries that saw genuine chaos in its hospitals right at the start of the pandemic. Elsewhere, people are having to face the reality that actually Omicron seems uncontrollable by most policy measures, as well as being more mild in its effects. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, who steadfastly refused to reduce restrictions over Christmas and New Year, even as England did just that, she finally announced this week that she was relaxing restrictions. The fact that case numbers in England and Scotland, one more relaxed, the other more strict, have been broadly in line, rather underlined that the additional restrictions, in the face of Omicron at least, have not been making much difference. Sturgeon, who had sarcastically mocked a suggestion that isolation time should be reduced, has now said using restrictions was becoming less tolerable in the eyes of the population, that they were inflicting more harm over time, and they were not even effective. A fact rather dramatically illustrated by this graph, which shows Scotland faring worse, not better, soon after the new restrictions were brought in. Also the fact that the number of Scots requiring intensive care rose by just 1 to 43. So she went on to reduce exactly those isolation times as the first stage of her new approach, with more to follow. And this is the contradiction of Omicron, it seems. In some countries, the milder outcomes are being seen as justifying a relaxation of policy in spite of higher case rates. In other countries, the higher case rates are being seen as justifying a tightening of policy in spite of milder outcomes. As with the kids in school situation, I think what we're seeing is a political confusion as we reach the logical endpoint of the pandemic slightly ahead of where official policy can bring itself to contemplate it. Moving from a single variable focus on COVID rates to valuing the many factors in normal life again, it's proving difficult for many. They'll get there. The nature of skepticism in critical thinking and in science. It's a frequent topic in the discussion forums below these videos. I'm currently reading the book The Importance of Being Interested by Robert Ince, one of the co-presenters of a radio show The Infinite Monkey Cage. In talking about the nature of skepticism, and particularly the techniques used by conspiracists, Ince made one comment when describing the live lectures of David Icke, he who would persuade you that the world is run by humanoid lizards. And he said this: in his live lectures, he can appear to be encouraging you to question things. but actually he's encouraging you to reject things. It appears that he's offering you a more expansive view, freed from societal shackles, when he's actually limiting what you can accept. I realise this summed up nicely the difference between genuine skeptics, people who will always admit of uncertainty and who will look for evidence behind claims with an open mind, and people who call themselves skeptics, but really all they've done is take membership of a tribe that rejects an orthodox view and supplants it with their own. Unlike the genuine skeptics, they are completely certain in their beliefs, which is the exact antithesis of skepticism, and they are never to be found expressing skepticism in a claim made by people on their own side. Whether we're talking about Extinction Rebellion or we're talking about the standard fans of Tony Heller, I can't recall ever seeing more than 2 or 3 who ever said a critical thing about an argument advanced by their own side. When it comes to the climate skeptics, there is no one alternative view agreed upon by that community. There's a kaleidoscope of different flavours. People who profess to support Tony Heller and Judith Curry and Willie Soon and Freeman Dyson, they're lining up behind multiple different perspectives and points of view. Some of which would agree that warming is happening, some of which would say that it's all faked. It's hard to see how you can support all of them at the same time if you're critically examining ideas rather than doing the science equivalent of supporting your sports team. Now, I don't say that especially to rag on climate skeptics or indeed on Extinction Rebellion, but simply to make this observation about the nature of skepticism. Skepticism is open to the possibility of error, so does not talk in claims of exaggerated certainty. It is curious about the truth, regardless of who is the vehicle for it at any one time, and it is interested in arguments and evidence, not tribal loyalty or affiliation. I'm glad that increasingly I see more people on this channel from a number of different starting points who do engage with issues and approach them with a degree of humility as to their starting position, which doesn't mean you have to change your mind if the evidence in front of you doesn't warrant it. For me, that's way more important than what you currently believe, whether or not you define yourself as a truth seeker first and foremost, rather than as a representative of a tribe. People think that they are skeptics if they reject the mainstream narrative, but on its own, that's just a process of choosing a side. Beware of any self-contained belief system that is immune to logic and indifferent to evidence. All right. My thanks as usual to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without them, I couldn't be looking to produce 3 videos per week every week through 2022. I certainly couldn't stick to my guns of focusing on the important issues and taking the evidence-led approach to them, in spite of how the algorithm tries to push you towards feeding the polarised extremes. If you would like to help this channel make its mark this year, to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.